So I worked with, for years, Myers-Briggs, for DISC, with colors, with all these different kinds of communication assessments or personality assessment, preferences, those kinds of things. And they're definitely valuable on an individual level. It's super good to know where are my blind spots, how am I going to tend to want to communicate or gather information, what's beneficial, what's not beneficial. Where I had difficulty kind of consistently implementing those models was, they were long. Like Myers-Briggs is super long. You get a super long report. It's a complicated report to understand. Some of them also felt not accurate in a way to the people who were taking them. So they would feel like, yeah, sometimes, but not always. I don't feel like this is quite me. I can't quite resonate. And then the biggest difficulty I think I had across all of those types was it's a really big leap from my personality and my style to the meeting that I'm in the next week. And how do I use that? How do I spread it in an effective way across my team without it feeling really soft and really woo-woo? People would say that it just doesn't feel close enough to business. So when I was introduced to 5 Dynamics, which I can't even remember how I was introduced to it now, but there were a couple of things that stuck out to me. First of all, it's related directly to work process. So it's a one-to-one. You get the result and you can use it the next day in the task that you're doing with your team. And you can say, where should we be in our work process right now? So it's applicable to making your teamwork more effective, your project work more effective. And then it highlights for the team why, rather than being a personality characteristic, it's where am I most comfortable in the work? Where do I have the most energy in the work? And so it made it much more straightforward to be applicable in an effective way. I don't have to tread on somebody else's personality preferences or someone else's need for sensing and data, to use Myers-Briggs language. Instead, I could say, we should be in this process right now of exploring, and somebody who has less tolerance, less energy, less stamina for exploring, they want to get to execution fast, or they want to examine and find the holes and what's the plan going to be. It gives the group that common understanding that somebody is going to be having to put out extra energy to get through certain stages. And so they can more effectively plan for and know how to expect a project to run, and even how to plan individual meetings. So I think that's the first thing. I mean, that's a lot of things, but the one-to-one relation of the results to the work process. The second thing that I would say that's really different about the methodology is it's so short. But the reports that come out, hands down, every single time, people would say this is spooky accurate. How can it possibly know this with so few questions? And the other layer of the reports is what it gives you to work with other people. So here's how to understand the other person you're working with, and therefore what you need to be aware of in your own style that will either help or hinder, not so much the relationship, but the getting the work done. And so for the people that I worked with, that really resonated and it felt relevant, it felt more immediately useful, and it felt more tangible to them. So I think all of those things together are the differences that I felt with using 5 Dynamics compared to all the other tools that I've ever used. Executive team at a startup technology company. The team had been together, the company actually was 8 years old, so it was not technically in age a startup, but in size and revenue, it was still a startup company. And the leadership team had also been together for those entire 8 years. They all had a tremendous amount of respect for each other. They did things outside of work together. They were struggling though, and the problem that they presented me with was, we need a decision-making framework. We need rules to follow when we have to make a decision, because what was happening was the team would start arguing with one another from their own particular agendas, totally natural. Customer success wants something different than finance wants something different than professional services, than engineering. and they all have their competing priorities. And what would happen is they would get deadlocked and have to go to the CEO. And so for the further growth of the company, it's not good for the CEO to have to spend his time understanding the level of detail that he would have to understand to feel he was making the right decision on the behalf of the company. So this is what they came to me with as the problem. And as I watched them trying to problem solve, they would get one idea on the table in the first 5 minutes of a meeting, and then they would spend the rest of the allocated time, beating that idea to death. One person arguing for it vehemently, why it's right, why it's the best thing, and everybody else just poking holes. So they would never get ideas on the table, and they would all get frustrated. They would all start to take it personally. They would all see somebody going down the normal path that they would go, or the habitual path that they would go, and people would just check out. You could see them pick up their phone, they'd lean back, they'd get on their computer, because they'd say, we're no longer getting anything useful done here now. And so we did the 5 dynamics assessment with them, and I don't remember what it's called. I think I refer to it as a spider graph, but it's the team depiction. And it shows in a square with the corners going, where does your team's energy tend to lie? And on this particular team, no surprise, technical software company, it lay mostly in examine. And there were a couple of people, one-offs, right, that were in explore, that were in excite. And then everybody else was just super energized around examine. And it was interesting to draw the conclusion then to see why one person actually was sort of outside the rest of the team. And this was the one person who was about excite. She happened to sit in marketing. And she knew the importance of how do we get other people on board with what you're saying. And so she was usually trying to argue from other people's points of view. So let's talk about an idea. Let's not examine just the pure rightness or wrongness or effectiveness or ineffectiveness of it. Let's talk about how we'd be able to get other people on board. So we did the assessment, we showed that graph, and immediately everybody just said, oh, no wonder we can never get anything done. We don't get enough ideas on the table. We don't talk about how to get buy-in. We may never get to execution because we spend so much time just poking holes in it and trying to examine and plan and schedule and figure out the best way to implement something. And so we did the assessment. They read their reports. They were, luckily for me in this position as facilitating, they were open-minded enough to say, you're right, this is our blind spot, and we hold it as a group, and we can see how the collective strength in this one area has served us. But we also are seeing how when we come talk to you about decision making, it's our own problem. We're not recognizing where everybody is. And so over time, and by time I only mean maybe 3 meetings, the language was in there where somebody would see the old habit taking over and somebody would say, hang on, we're still supposed to be exploring. Let's not pick that idea apart quite yet. Let's keep just getting the ideas out on the table. So you could start to see that language appearing in their regular group process. And I think the other thing was that when they would meet together, they'd be able to be much more productive because they would know that one person, for example, wants to, excite without getting enough ideas yet. And so they would be able to say, let's get the ideas out first. They'd say, I want to give you enough time to make sure you're comfortable with this idea, whatever it was. They became much more, I don't want to say polite because it wasn't polite, but it was accommodating and leveraging each other's styles to make it effective. So at that executive team level, that was a huge success. And then the other success is just to kind of contrast between levels and how it can be utilized is, a lot of times companies will focus, rightfully so, development efforts on the management level, on the VP level, and they'll throw technical or knowledge things to the employee culture, but they don't always throw these, how do you just become a better professional opportunities to the employees. And at this same company, there was already an organic program alive, which was for people who are super interested in fixing chronic problems at the company. There was a quarterly forum that they could join, and they ran it themselves. They picked the thing they wanted to work on themselves. Sometimes it was a big deal, like how do we reduce our spend on AWS? Sometimes it was a small thing like the conference calls keep dropping. There's never enough pens in there. Somebody took all the chairs out of the conference room. You know, they're a small thing, but when you're going back to back to back in meetings and you're wasting 15 minutes just finding a pen, it's frustrating. And it was enough that people wanted to fix it. So this group of people would come together for a quarter and they would find a way to fix it. They'd get an opportunity to talk to the executive team. They'd argue for funding. They would do a presentation at the all hands meeting. And it was pretty successful. And when I came on board, I saw an opportunity, which was, why don't we teach them some skills there? Also, it was starting to lose some energy. People were less motivated to jump in and fix things. The company was getting more complex. Their jobs were taking more time. And so I thought, why don't we add some development opportunity to it so that not only they feel like they're getting something out of it, but that then that would spread. And I started with the whole idea of 5 dynamics and how can this help us install a really consistent approach to work. So if every project team who would, you know, come together and then disband, come together and disband, if they all had the idea in their head that we need to follow these steps, that's what's going to make our project work effective. That obviously is going to be great if we can have that collective knowledge base. And then the second thing was, you have this work right here, work that they're motivated to do. They're choosing to join this particular program. And so let's use that context to help them learn the skills rather than just sit in a class, hear about it, isn't it interesting, but then go back to work where they join a project team that has the same old habits. And it's really difficult in that dynamic to be the person who says, well, I just went to training and I learned that we should think about it this way. It's really hard to do that and change who you are in front of those people. So this gave them the knowledge, the method, the context to actually do work. And there were some other elements that we put in there as well, like what are techniques that you need to know about influencing other people? What are things that you can observe in a team trying to solve a really complex problem? You know, are there people who try to solve it all themselves? Are there people who get overwhelmed and check out? Are there people who will actually touch other people's stuff and move it because they think it's the right way to do? So we gave them a lot of different things in addition to that, but the foundation really was this knowledge of the work process and where their energies lie. And what we saw was, it was really cool. It was people who were junior level who would go in, and if a meeting wasn't being run well, they could say, I have a suggestion. They could put this, we had developed sort of standard kind of spreadsheet things that would put the project into these categories of what's the problem we're trying to solve, let's explore and figure it out, what it is that we're trying to solve. Let's figure out who do we need to have as stakeholders and how do we go get them excited and bought into this particular proposal that we have. Now let's make the plan and examine all the different pieces that might come up, and then let's go execute. And you know, 100 years ago, it's common knowledge out there. If you spend this much time planning, then you really can only spend this much time executing, and it will be the right stuff. And this is another, and I think more effective way of thinking about it now. So it was great to see it flow through the organization and help as we took on, as a company, you know, bigger, more complex things, to have that common language, that common approach, that common awareness that people would not devolve into conflict when somebody who had more energy in one area, you know, took over or derailed. They could solve it right then, rather than it becoming, you know, oh, that David, why is he always like that? He's always trying to push his way through. He's not. He's just tired of exploring and he wants to get to examining. It helped us improve the way we were giving feedback. So our HR business partners could watch a team working together and give them feedback to say, here's what you missed, and let me just point that out. So let's make sure we're spending enough time here. So another benefit that I noticed, especially for a technology company, and this is coming from in my work history, I've worked at companies that combined technology and art. For example, I worked in the video game industry. So you were naturally balanced. You know, you had representation of kind of opposite ends of the spectrum as you went about trying to come up with a product. And so you had that natural healthy tension between different desires and what things should look like or how long something should take. In a straight technology company where you're dealing with software development, where you're dealing with, you know, optimizing web searches or whatever it is, where it's very highly technically oriented and almost the product is kind of, it's just a byproduct of the effort that people get to put in and the space that they get to work in, the skills that they get to use, the knowledge that they get to use. So one of the things I think that's particularly challenging in any technology company is people who want to produce the perfect solution rather than the solution that will meet ultimately the customer's needs. And that it's not always a one-to-one, well, the customer said this, so that's what I built. Sometimes you also want to develop that skill in those engineers, in those technologically minded people to be able to say, I'm going to use my knowledge and my expertise to forecast that this customer is actually going to want something slightly different. And I am going to use that knowledge to help prioritize and decide what I'm going to work on. So in a honestly, admittedly, sorry, stereotypical way, and it's common for all humans, we tend to lean more towards, I want to tell you everything I know about something rather than let me tell you what's going to be useful for you right now. And engineers are no exception. You know, they want to build the best thing they possibly can build, even if it goes beyond what's necessary. Artists would like to take the most time they possibly can to make the most beautiful painting, to render the best architectural design of something. And it's hard sometimes to recognize when our skill and our passion actually isn't serving us anymore in the business. And so I think what Simpli5 also did for us in a really non-threatening way was enable a highly technical population to be able to make that transition to seeing the value in the other steps of the process so that they didn't get tunneled in to, I want to build the best mousetrap I can possibly build, when really all it needs to do is one thing. And so I think that it helps the culture on the whole learn that.